All right, class. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite American authors, and that is Edgar Allan Poe. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so Poe, we'll start with some biographical information. I think it's important to know a little bit about the authors, although the work itself is separate from the author or the artist. When an author creates a work, they certainly do put themselves into that work. But once the work goes out into the ether and it's read by other people, it becomes its own thing, right? But nevertheless, I think with Poe in particular, it's very important to understand his biography because I get a lot of questions from students like, hey, what's with this guy? He's a little bit dark, right? And so we kind of have to explain why that is, and his life will make that make sense. He was a very talented person, there's no question about it, especially in the area of language and the use of language, and also the art of storytelling. But he was an incredibly faulted person also who suffered a great deal during his life, and that suffering played a huge role in the way that his works would develop. So he was he lost several family members to disease. He was also addicted to alcohol and also gambling at one point in his life. His mother was an actress, a classically trained actress. He did get some exposure to the arts as a child, but his real mother died at the age of 24. Edgar Allan Poe was only 3, so he did not know her very well. What memories he did have of her were very distant. He was sent to live with a successful tobacco merchant named John Allan and his wife, Frances. Poe bonded with Frances, but he experienced friction with John, who wanted Poe to follow in the family business. So imagine if you're an artist or something and your dad wants you to pick up the family tobacco business. There would be a little bit of friction there. The vision that John Allan had for his adopted son was very different than the vision that Poe had for himself. He also had, I think, probably a genetic proclivity to the language arts. Like his mother was a very language arts-minded person. And I find that there's a certain type of person that gravitates towards that. And I think he probably was one just in his very being. And so he wanted to be a poet, among other things. He would write poems on the back of work notes and stuff like that. He resisted his caretaker's wishes, and he attended the University of Virginia, but he could not receive enough funds from John Allan to afford tuition. This caused Poe to turn to gambling, which is a great way to get out of debt, folks, right? And he quickly became too indebted to remain at school. So already we have the setback of his mother's loss, living with a new family, and then he tries to go to university to live his dream and can't make it work, ends up gambling, gets in debt, has to go home. When he gets home, insult to injury, he finds that the woman he was married to, who was a woman named Sarah Elmira Royster, had become engaged to someone else. So he also lost his marital prospects. And marriage in the olden days, although this isn't terribly long ago, but it was a way to solidify your status in society. And if you were to have a good marriage and it then fell through, it would be kind of devastating for you in terms of your ability to build a life for yourself. So Edgar Allan Poe, by the way, he lived from 1809 to 1849. So I want to make sure that we know the time. It's not that long ago, but it's long enough, right? So desperate, he eventually joined the army. Doesn't seem like an army guy, but he did join it in 1827. And in 1829, his foster mother, the one he bonded with, remember, Frances Allan, she died of tuberculosis. So here it is again, another death of tuberculosis. First his mother, then his stepmother. So around this time, John Allan got him into West Point Academy so that he could again have a chance at becoming formally educated, which is what he really wanted because he wanted a career in the arts. So he excelled at his studies at West Point, but it's a military school. Edgar Allan Poe, not really a military guy, very heady, off in a dreamland kind of thing. So he eventually was kicked out for poor maintenance of duties. So again, another setback for Poe, right? Are we starting to understand why he's a little bit dark? I think anybody would be. So after West Point, he began the career that he would be best known for during his life. He was a scathing literary critic and editor. A lot of people don't know this about Poe. They just know him for his short stories and his poems. But actually, in his life, he made most of his money writing as a critic, at least at first. And he wrote short stories at this time and kind of got some notoriety for a few of them, but he didn't really blow up in that way until later. As a literary critic, he was very well read and actually pretty fierce in his takedowns of some people. And I imagine he made a few enemies in that process. He eventually was deeply tortured, probably the worst loss of his life. He lost his wife. Her name I have not included here. I should have. But she was 13 when they married, which is going to seem to all of you pretty abhorrent and horrible. All I can say about that is that the taboos that are in place now didn't really exist then. It's not to say that they don't exist now for a good reason. I think they certainly do. But in the past, it just wasn't as taboo for particularly young women to be married very young. And the death of his young wife caused him a lot of grief. He clearly loved her very much. And she died when she was in her 20s. I want to say mid-20s. And she died of tuberculosis as well. So he's got a like triple whammy from this disease. And this should show you the importance of modern medicine, right? And things like vaccines and remedies and cures. Because in this day and age, you could catch a cold and that would be your last hurrah, right? You could catch something, just in a random way, and that's the last time you wake up. So it's good that we live in the modern times, because the times in the past were, and this is even still in the wake of the scientific revolution, when some of those advents have already been made. If you go back far enough, like to ancient Mesopotamian stuff, people were lucky to reach 30. A lot of people don't realize this. And so anyway, her death caused him a lot of grief. Sorry, getting my words mixed up. A lot of grief, and he became horribly depressed. He turned to alcohol. I believe he may have even dabbled in opiates and stuff like that, opium. And he just really, his health started to decline, and he really just fell apart. But in this period of time, interestingly enough, even though he was suffering greatly in this last decade of his life, this is the period of the time when most of the great works that we know him for were produced. I think it's kind of interesting sometimes to consider the link between suffering and creativity, because there's clearly one there. Many artists suffer in a very visible way. Think about Vincent van Gogh, horribly depressed, cut off his own ear, experienced psychosis, eventually committed suicide by shooting himself through the gut. But by golly, isn't Starry Night a beautiful painting, right? So anyway, sorry to get a little grim there. I did warn you. After his wife's death, he also began to delve into detective fiction. This is also when he wrote Raven, because if you recall, if you've ever read The Raven before, a lot of people have read Poe because he's canonically taught in high school, and sometimes even before that. He wrote The Raven, and the poem opens with a man sitting in his study trying to study things to keep his mind occupied from the loss of his young wife. So we see his loss directly bleeding into his works. But he also began detective fiction, which at this time hadn't really developed. Now we all know Sherlock Holmes. We know a good whodunit. We've all seen Scooby-Doo. But at this point in time, that stuff didn't really exist. And so it didn't exist in as prevalent as it does now. So he contributed to the development of that art form and was very good at it. And his stories are very suspenseful and very clever. He was a clever man, clearly. But he died in 1849 of reported congestion of the brain, which nobody really knows what this is. Could have very easily been rabies, people have postulated. Could have been carbon monoxide poisoning. Could have been related to alcoholism and alcohol-related dementia. The fact is that nobody really knows how he died. The cause is listed as congestion of the brain, which is really a symptom of a cause, right? What is it that caused the congestion? So a lot of people have speculated. It's kind of a spooky end for a spooky guy, and it's really just kind of a footnote of just how much this guy suffered, and it should explain why it is, his stories take on this sort of macabre tone, and they embrace the tones of death and madness and despair and suspense and all these things that we tend to shy away from in our own lives. He embraced them in his art form and turned them into pieces that people enjoy now hundreds of years later, which is interesting. Okay, let's go on to the next page. All right. Couple of things that we need to know. I said genres. You could really call these literary movements. Genre is kind of a flexible term, I guess. The Romantic movement is, so Poe is part of two movements. He's part of the Romantic movement and the Gothic movement. The Romantic movement was a literary movement spanning from the late 18th to the middle 19th century. So he would have been kind of on the early front of that. It was, in many ways, a reaction to the scientific and industrial revolutions, other social revolutions as well, such as the integration of Enlightenment values that we see in things like the American Constitution and stuff like that. There were all these revolutions going on, revolutions in thought, revolutions in technology, revolutions in art and language and poetry, and so he was at the forefront of that movement as an American. Most of the Romantics are, in fact, British. But Poe is an American Romantic, which makes him kind of special in that way, because it wasn't as prominent here. It was prominent everywhere, but it wasn't as prominent here. So the primary concerns of Romanticism are not like roses are red, violets are blue, gee golly gosh, I sure do love you. That's not the kind of romantic that we're talking about. The Romantic concerns were focusing on the empowerment of the individual, the reclamation of religion and spirituality in the face of science. So science had encroached upon the area of religion's area to define how people saw reality. Some of that was obviously necessary. Some of that Poe and other Romantics believed was a little bit of an overstep on the part of science, because even though they had a methodology that allowed us to understand universal phenomena, they still weren't at the time, in the view of the Romantics, very good at answering the big picture questions like, who are we? Where do we come from? And human beings have always used the myth and the religious enterprise to answer these questions. And all of a sudden, the scientific revolution comes around and kind of wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the Romantics were like, hey, I don't know, maybe there's a place for religion. Let's parcel through it again and see what value there is here, right? And you can definitely see that in some of his poetry, such as Sonnet to Science, which he basically refers to science as a vulture, an ugly vulture that has chewed his dreams. Yeah. So anyway, they also were opposed. Opposed is a strong word. They were critical of the Industrial Revolution. They thought that the Industrial Revolution, in particular, was encroaching upon nature and the natural space. The Romantic poets love nature. They exalt nature. Nature is divine. Nature is spirit. And these ugly factories and stuff, these are an encroachment upon spirit. They are satanic in essence, as William Blake said. And so that is part of the Romantic movement as well, the celebration of nature. Also, the spontaneous outpouring of powerful feelings, as William Wordsworth said. This is another goal of the Romantics. They want you to feel stuff. They want you to feel the pain of other people. They want you to feel the beauty of the sublime and the sort of the divine nature of our existence and our cohabitation with nature in the natural world. So many Romantics also focused on the cause of reforming society. So they were social reformists, basically, reformists. They wanted to change things they saw as cruel and unjust, like child labor, which we no longer have, thanks in part to people like the Romantics. Also, William Blake was critical of slavery because he was one of the early Romantics, and it was still going on at the time that he was writing. The poor conditions of industrial factories and those types of things, right? The conditions that people lived in. There was no workers' comp at this time. You got injured at the factory, that was it. You had to find some other means of feeding yourself and your family. Oh, you lost a limb in the factory? Well, I guess that's your problem, right? So now we don't really view the world in that way. So I guess Romanticism has some value, right? We could say that it contributed to the to those reformations. Excuse me. So important English Romantics to consider alongside Edgar Allan Poe: William Blake, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Edgar Allan Poe was considered an American romantic, and he shared many of the same objectives and thematic concerns as his English counterparts who were really piloting this movement. Romantic literature includes poetry, short fiction, and novels and novellas. Okay, so it's a pretty diverse form of literature. One of my favorites, to be honest. Then we have the Gothic genre. Ooh, right? What does Gothic mean? Gothics are those kids that shop at Hot Topic and they buy the chain wallets. Apologies to anyone that owns a chain wallet. I think they're cool, but I gotta get it in there somehow. And I've also heard that Hot Topic doesn't sell that much goth stuff anymore. They're into pop culture and anime, which kind of stunned me because when I was a kid, they were, that's where you went to buy the heavy metal shirts and stuff. Anyway, so it's not really that kind of Gothic, although they do have kind of a similar origin in terms of what the term means. But Gothic literature derives its name from the medieval Gothic architecture, which is often featured in many of the Gothic texts, like castles and stuff like that. It's an offshoot of Romanticism, which incorporates elements of the macabre, the supernatural, and the suspenseful to explore the darker side of the human experience, dealing with issues like madness, insanity, illness, death, loss, the subconscious mind, and supernatural terror. The Gothic genre is bold and unapologetic in its dissection of the human underbelly. You like that, human underbelly? I thought that was clever. That's why I wrote it. In any case, Gothic literature is kind of like a proto-horror. You could think of it that way. Not quite so much investment in the gore and stuff, but the techniques like suspense and emphasis on madness and decay and corruption and these kinds of things. That is really where this stuff comes in. So the last thing I'm going to do, and this is great that my voice is starting to give out as I'm ready to do this, and I do not have any water, which is wonderful. So I guess I'll just power through it. We're going to read a short piece by Edgar Allan Poe. It is called The Mask of the Red Death. Ooh, back me on the camera there. Got a little spooky. The Mask of the Red Death. So here we go. The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. I just said that. It's copyright information, which you will need for citations. Actually, this text I have is just the story of the Mask of the Red Death. The text you will be citing is the anthology, which is in Blackwork. Okay, so the Mask of the Red Death is obviously about a disease called the Red Death. So here we go. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then the profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban, which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. So basically, he's describing here a disease that you catch and you bleed out and die. So it's like Ebola, which is interesting because I don't think Ebola had really been discovered, or Marburg virus, or whatever it was called originally. I don't think it had been discovered at this point in time. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But it's interesting. How did Poe, did he catch word of a disease like this, or did he make it up in his head? In any case, there is a disease like that, and it's really horrific. Okay. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric and yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many places, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon the closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to a pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. When the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming clock, and there was the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. So this I'm going to stop here for a second, because this sequence of rooms, there's something going on there. What are these rooms? What do they mean? Why are they different colors? Why can't you see from one room into the other? What is the function of this design in terms of its relation to the meaning of the piece? That is an interesting question, because at the end, you have this 7th room, and it has the red panes, red like blood, and the clock. This is what we call in the study of literature foreshadowing. The author is telling you what is going to happen without telling you what is going to happen, right? And so you fill in the blank. What do you think happens in this story with these rich partners who have tried to shut themselves in away from the rest of the world that suffers? I don't know. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and to see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon a of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. But be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of us what been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands still in the hall of velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes and the chimes die away. They have endured but an instant, and the light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly empathetic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. Do you see what he did there? Beat feverishly. And the revel went whirringly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept in with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation, surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and disgust. Assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed his visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet, all this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed. In the first moment, or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming on the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterward, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and like mask with which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form, meaning there was no one behind the mask. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the light of the ebony clock went out with that of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Okay, that's I love this. I love this story. First of all, I think it's beautiful. I think the language is beautiful. If you hear the way it flows, I mean, it's so much fun to read. This is why I read this one to you, because it's like, I got to. The other thing I want to say is there is definitely a meaning here. There's a critical meaning, and you probably didn't see it. This is a critique primarily of the aristocracy, the ruling class, right? The ruling class, the kings and the queens and the dukes and this and that, and everybody who's anybody, the important people. They wall themselves into a castle and they imagine that they can escape the fate that so many other people suffer. But as we see in the story, they can't. They're having a big party. By the way, if you want to avoid a plague, maybe don't invite 1,000 of your friends to a party. We learned that in quarantine, right? But nevertheless, that's what they did. And turns out, castle doesn't keep out germs, right? Especially if you let people in, you let anybody in. It doesn't matter that they're noble. There's nothing about being that means that you don't have the capacity. That human beings have a kind of an equality. It doesn't have the same fate. It doesn't matter the king's money and his riches and stuff. It doesn't stave him from death. And I think that's a really powerful message, and I think it's one that we all can take to heart. So while you are reading the remaining stories from Edgar Allan Poe, be thinking about some of the themes and concepts that we mentioned earlier, some of the history also, and try to figure out what this guy is all about. You might be able to find audio recordings if you look on YouTube, if that's your thing. Otherwise, happy reading, and I look forward to the next video.